Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, thank you for inviting me here today. So my name is Sigrid Møyner Hohle. I'm currently a PhD student at Simula Research Laboratory, working on a project about uncertainty communication and climate change. But today I'm going to talk about my master thesis that I did last year in psychology with support from Green Nudge. So I will talk about nudging as a mean to reduce meat consumption. Does this work? Thank you. As you all know, there are several good reasons to eat less meat. The United Nations has declared meat production one of the top 2 or 3 most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale, from the local to the global. The impact is so significant, they warn, that it needs to be addressed with urgency. And just this morning, Norwegian newspapers, they wrote about a new report. And this report describes how Norway can reach our climate goals by, among other things, reducing our meat consumption by 18%. And meat production...
Just adjust it.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay?
Yeah.
Oh, that's better. Okay. So, meat production not only contributes to climate change, there are also a bunch of health benefits of eating less red meat and more vegetables than we do in Norway today. So, why can't we just tell people all these arguments and they will all turn vegan? The cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead famously said, "It's easier to change a man's religion than his diet." People are not 100% rational, and therefore, no matter how sound and convincing an argument might seem, it seldom makes us actually change behavior. Some researchers added an information sign to a restaurant menu in order to make more people select the vegetarian dishes. So beside of the vegetarian dishes, they put up a text saying, "Less meat can help to reduce our environmental impact." So do you think this made more people order the vegetarian dishes? No, nothing happened. People mostly selected the meat dishes, just as before. So, if rational arguments don't work, how can we then stimulate behavioral change? So, as you know by now, a potentially more effective method is nudging. And I will not go into details because Stefan already had a presentation, but in brief, instead of appealing to our rational considerations like attitude campaigns or information signs will do, the point of nudging is simply to design the choice situation, so the situation where people make choices, in such a way that, for instance, the most sustainable option becomes the most intuitive and easy to select. And this is done by using psychological knowledge about how people actually make their choices. So I wanted to find a way to make it easier to select vegetarian food. But first I needed to know what guides us when we select food. Because when we select one food product or one dish over another, we do so for a number of reasons. And some of them are what we call individual factors, like habits. So studies show that we often just simply buy what we usually buy, especially when we are in a hurry. And we're also led by our identity, culture, and values, such as our care for environment or care for animals, and our attitudes and beliefs towards different foods and different diets are also important. So, one study explored people's attitudes to vegetarian and vegan diets. And so people who ate meat themselves, they described these diets as healthy, but also as bland, tasteless, low in fat, nutritionally unbalanced, restrictive, extreme, and unnatural. So, if these are the attitudes that people have to vegetarian diets, this will most likely influence how people perceive vegetarian food in general. But it isn't only our inner habits and attitudes that matter. Whether we choose the tomato or the bacon pasta also depends on situational factors. How are the dishes presented? An American consumer psychologist named Brian Wansink has conducted a number of studies on how people make food choices. And in his best-selling book, Mindless Eating, he demonstrates that we are highly influenced by how the food is presented, maybe far more than we like to believe. So one important factor is the portion size. In one of his experiments, Brian Wansink found out that people, they ate much more popcorn when they got a big container instead of a small one, even when the popcorn was 14 days old and stale, and the participants afterwards reported that it tasted really bad. We also rely on convenience. Often, we simply choose what is put in front of us, or the default option. And the name of the dish also affects our perception of the food and whether we select it. In one study, Brian Wansink gave some of the dishes in a restaurant menu more descriptive and attractive names. So, for instance, he changed seafood fillet into succulent Italian seafood fillet. So do you think this small change in the menu could affect the customers in any way? Absolutely. First of all, the sales of these descriptive named dishes went up by 27%. But that wasn't all. After having eaten the dishes, the customers also rated these descriptive named dishes as more appealing, tastier, and even more caloric. And they even rated the restaurant as a whole as better. And they were willing to pay more for the dish and had bigger intentions to buy them again. So, a descriptive name can both make us want to buy a dish and actually make it taste better. In spite of this, how do we often find vegetarian food presented in cafe and restaurant menus? If present in the menu at all, it's often simply named vegetarian. And this is nice for vegetarians, obviously, as they can easily find their dish. But what about the rest of us? Imagine that you are a hungry customer scanning the menu for something rich and satisfying and tasteful. Would you consider the dish simply named vegetarian? I never did before I became a semi-vegetarian some years ago. And still it bothers me to order the vegetarian. It makes me feel that I have a diagnosis or that I belong to a sect and that I sacrifice something. And why is that? Well, first of all, the name vegetarian is extremely broad. It could mean anything that does not contain meat, illustrated here by a lentil burger or a spicy Indian dal, grilled vegetables, or lasagna with mozzarella and tomato. Imagine if all dishes containing meat were simply named meat. Whether it was a hamburger, reindeer stew, Caesar salad, or carpaccio. That would be absurd. But maybe because the meat is in majority, these dishes, they get a nice and specific presentation, while the one or few vegetarian dishes are often put into the broad category of vegetarian. And because it's so general, the name vegetarian is not likely to evoke any pleasant taste associations or expectations. Actually, it says nothing about contents or taste. The name vegetarian is maybe mostly reflective of what the dish does not contain, meat. And you remember what those meat eaters thought of vegetarian and vegan diets in general? Well, if they perceive these as boring, bland, and low in fat, the names vegetarian or vegan will most likely produce similar associations. And moreover, the name vegetarian can appear excluding for non-vegetarians. It could communicate that these dishes are meant for vegetarians only, but not for me. And it can even be an ideological name. It's almost as if you need to agree to a set of political ideas and a certain worldview if you order this dish. So, unless you are a vegetarian, extreme animal activist, vote green and wear purple clothes, you might jump to the rest of the menu. So, I decided to set up a field experiment to test whether I could make more customers select the vegetarian dishes if they were presented a little bit differently in the menu. So I did the experiment in a cafe here in Oslo selling wraps. I tested 4 different menu posters. And I also gave a survey to 356 customers to test whether these new menus would work better for some customers than for others. So this is what I did. This was the first poster that I tested. This is how the wraps were originally presented in the cafe, so I used it as the control poster. So there are 9 wraps, of which 2 are vegetarian, and these are explicitly named vegetarian and vegan. And the vegetarian wraps, they contain ingredients like taco beans, guacamole, homemade tomato salsa with coriander. Therefore, in the second poster, I changed the name of the vegetarian options into Mexican style. So the aim was to give customers associations of what the dish really contains and tastes like, and its more spicy and exotic features. And in the third poster, I made the vegetarian option the wrap of the day, but the price was still the same. And then in the last poster, I combined the two. So the vegetarian wrap was now named Mexican style, and it was the wrap of the day. So which one do you think turned out the most effective? So these are the results, the percentage of customers selecting the vegetarian option in the 4 conditions. Is this? Yeah. So here is the control condition. So as you can see, these 2 nudges, they didn't work at all. They even led to less customers selecting vegetarian. But in the combination nudge with the Mexican style and dish of the day, the percentage who selected this rose from 15% in the control condition and up to 24%. So one of the reasons this might have worked is what we call the yeah, whatever effect. We have to make so many choices every day, and many of them regarding food, that sometimes it's convenient to simply choose the default option. But as we can see, this dish of the day, it worked only as long as it had a more attractive name, not with the vegetarian name. But did this menu work better for some customers than for others? So in a survey, I asked the customers some questions to test this. And the results, they show that the nudge, the last nudge, was especially effective for a certain type of customers. It worked for those who were otherwise unlikely to select vegetarian. One of the things I asked the customers was how much meat they ate in their daily lives. And it turned out that the new poster worked especially among the customers who usually ate a lot of meat. This graph shows the number of meat lovers who selected vegetarian. So meat lovers, more than half of the customers, they reported to eat 5 meat dinners or more a week. And so these are who I call them meat lovers. And of these, only 3% selected the vegetarian option when it was called vegetarian, but 24% selected it when it was called Mexican style and was dish of the day. And probably related to meat habits, I also measured a trait called connection to nature. This is a well-studied variable in the field of environmental psychology. It reflects to which extent an individual feels related to nature and feels like a part of nature. And I looked especially at individuals' concern about the effect of human actions on the environment and their care for other species. And the last nudge, Mexican-style dish of the day, worked especially for the customers with a low connection to nature. So people with a low environmental concern and low care for animals, they were unlikely to select vegetarian when it was called vegetarian, but became far more likely when it was called Mexican style and made the dish of the day. So what do these results mean? First of all, the name of a dish matters. The name vegetarian seems to attract only customers who usually eat little meat and have strong environmental values and care for animals. So because these customers, they have a strong inner motivation to buy vegetarian, they will maybe do so no matter how inconvenient it might be. But if the vegetarian dish is presented in a more descriptive and attractive way, it can become more attractive also for customers who usually eat much meat and who have less environmental values. And the study also shows that it might be a good idea to combine interventions, as I did when I combined the name change with a more prominent display, making it a dish of the day. So, changing the menu name, is that a manipulation of choice? Some people might say so. But first of all, I asked the customers how satisfied they were with their food, and there were no differences. So if some customers were manipulated into selecting vegetarian, this did not affect their satisfaction with the food. And secondly, the customers were 100% free to select a meat dish if they wanted to. They were still present in the menu. And thirdly, language is power. We are influenced or manipulated, if you want, by every food name, and by every menu, as well as by every buffet order or every plate size. So consider the name vegetarian. Is that a more neutral name than Mexican style? The name vegetarian might actually manipulate non-vegetarians into not buying it. So if we can present the food in such a way that the most sustainable and most healthy choice becomes easier to choose, while the cafe even makes more money because vegetables and beans is cheaper than meat, and customers are just as satisfied, I cannot see much paternalism in that. And one more thing, can nudging change our habits and attitudes? The cafe staff, they told me about this one customer who had come and asked for a Mexican style wrap. I bought it yesterday, he said. And at first I was a bit disappointed because I realized that it was without meat. But then I ate it, and it was so much better than the meat wrap that I usually buy. And so this story illustrates an important point, namely whether nudging can motivate people to try new things and over time change their habits. We know from research that if people are forced to try something new and are positively surprised by the new experience, this can make them change their habit. So maybe this could be the case for meat lovers as well. If they get to try vegetarian food and find out that it is tastier and richer than they thought it would be, and maybe even leaves them feeling light and healthy, could this make them want to eat more plant-based also in the future? And like Stefan also talked about, from a psychological perspective, it can also be argued that nudges might change attitudes. And some of you might know the theory of cognitive dissonance. Simply said, humans want to be consistent. We want harmony between what we do and what we think. So if we act non-environmentally, it's hard to still have pro-environmental attitudes. If I eat beef every day and drive to work, it would be uncomfortable to still argue that we ought to reduce meat consumption and car driving. It might be more comfortable to simply change my attitude instead. For instance, by rationalizing that my actions don't matter anyway, or my brother-in-law drives a more polluting car and eats more meat than me. But if nudging makes it easier to make sustainable choices, the attitudes might follow. Now that what I do is sustainable, it might be easier to have attitudes supporting climate change mitigation and also to take in and accept information about climate change in general. So I hope future studies will look at even smarter and more attractive ways to present vegetarian food and also look at the long-term effects of nudging. Thank you.